I'm Eddie Muller, and to celebrate the new year, we've got a red light blazing in Noir Alley this week. But if you think this is going to be a vintage Hollywood take on the world's oldest profession, cool your jets. This is a fairly routine revenge yarn, goosed almost to greatness by its fabulous style. But before we get into that, let me start by asking a question. In the pantheon of Golden Age stars, was there any actor worse than George Raft? Now, I'm not saying the man didn't have a presence and a hard-edged charisma, and there's no question that he was a hell of a dancer. But when it came to expressing emotion, Raft could run the gamut from A to A. Many critics at the time called him a cigar store Indian, which unfairly sells short the emotive capabilities of carved wood. Raft shot to fame in 1932's Scarface, where his stoic aplomb and coin-flipping finesse was a tonic to Paul Muni's broad, hyperactive acting style. Raft became a popular product of the time, his portrayals of flashy gangsters and hard-bitten working men striking a chord with Depression-era audiences who looked to tough guys like Raft, Cagney, and Robinson for tips on both style and survival. But for Raft, surviving through the 40s proved a tougher bargain. He lost out on many major roles. He'd been considered for The Maltese Falcon, Double Indemnity, and Casablanca, but instead found himself treading water in a steady stream of nervous A's, things like Johnny Angel, Nocturne, Intrigue, and Race Street. He still had enough juice and underworld associates you did not want to cross that he could demand his own director, which was usually Edwin L. Marin, a craftsman of no discernible distinction. None of those pictures I mentioned, all directed by Ed Marin, are flat out bad, but they're all less than they could have been with more inspiration and effort. Which brings us to today's noir, Red Light. In my opinion, far and away the best film on Raft's 1940s resume. One of the main reasons is that it's not directed by Edwin Marin. This is the handiwork of veteran Hollywood warhorse Roy Del Ruth, a guy who could pull rank on Raft and demand that little bit more. Del Ruth made dozens of good movies for Warner Brothers in the 30s, including the terrific Jimmy Cagney, Joan Blondell picture Blonde Crazy, the first version of Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, The Little Giant with Edward G. Robinson, and one of Raft's better efforts, It Had to Happen. Now, Del Ruth was so reliable that by the end of the decade, he'd become one of the highest paid directors in the business. After a slew of for-hire assignments during the war years, the director struck out on his own, forming Roy Del Ruth Productions. 1947's It Happened on Fifth Avenue was a pleasant enough comedy on which the director's name appeared above the title for the first time, a la Frank Capra, John Ford, William Wyler. But his next film, The Babe Ruth Story, was a critical disaster. Some reviewers called the 1948 release one of the worst movies ever made. Perhaps in desperation, Del Ruth retreated to terrain that had once served him well, crime pictures. The final film of short-lived Roy Del Ruth Productions was Red Light, the director's lone venture into the world of film noir, which is too bad because he clearly had a ball on this one, pulling out all the stylistic stops. He directs this thing like he's suddenly 20 years younger. Now, some of that credit must go to cinematographer Burt Glennon. He'd been around Hollywood since the silent days and became a favorite cameraman of directors like Ford, DeMille, and Joseph von Sternberg, for whom he shot Underworld, Blonde Venus, and The Scarlet Empress. He became a director himself in the late 20s, but found he preferred being behind the camera to sitting in the director's hot seat. With Red Light, Glennon returned to the kind of nocturnal dream world he'd created with von Sternberg. There are passages in it as strikingly photographed as anything in noir. He seemed to particularly relish throwing hard shadows on a pair of mugs very familiar to film noir fans, Raymond Burr and Henry Morgan.
So maybe I ain't in the spot. Maybe you are.
And Glennon passed his pictorial sense on to his son, Jim Glennon, who collaborated with writer-director Alexander Payne on 3 of his early films, and he was also the DP for the popular HBO series Deadwood. Now, if you skipped Mass today to watch Noir Alley, don't feel guilty. In fact, Jesus forgives you. Because as you're about to see, this film contains so much religious allegory, it could qualify as biblical noir. From 1949, the high watermark in Hollywood's flood of classic crime films, here's Red Light.
Thou shalt not kill. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord.
Johnny, you didn't.
No, Miss Nora. Johnny had nothing to do with this.
I'm so glad.
Well, Johnny, your brother believed that somebody else was on the job. Looks like he was right.
Now that's how you cap off a crime picture. An electrifying climax, complete with punchline, in neon no less. I don't think I oversold the fun that Roy Del Ruth and Burt Glennon had making this picture. Red Light was Del Ruth's first and last film noir, but Burt Glennon will be back. You'll see more of his remarkable camera work later this year on Noir Alley when I present the underseen and underrated Crime Wave. Now, you may have noticed in the opening titles a story credit for Donald Barry. Yes, that is Donald Red Barry, the actor best known for playing Red Ryder in the 1940 Western serial. That's how he got the nickname, Red. In addition to acting in lots of B films in the 40s and 50s, Barry wrote the original stories for 4 low-budget features. This was the first, which he called This Guy Gideon, a title that makes more sense than Red Light, although it's obviously not as provocative or as enticing. Now, I have a suspicion this movie got renamed to capitalize on its co-star, Virginia Mayo. Her previous picture was White Heat, which was a big hit for Warner Brothers. Although it was released only weeks prior to Red Light, White Heat had generated a huge advance buzz within the industry for the intensity of Jimmy Cagney's performance and Raoul Walsh's powerhouse direction. In that film, Mayo had one of her rare provocative roles as Cagney's sexy wife, who's cheating on him with gang member Steve Cochran. United Artists created posters for Red Light that made it look like she was still playing her White Heat character, taking everything Raft has, when of course she's quite chaste and sensible in this picture.
You can't take the law into your own hands. Things aren't done that way.
That depends on who's doing them.
In fact, Despite having a face and figure that PR hacks love to describe as a pinup come to life, Virginia Mayo rarely played the sexy bad girl. Even in noir films that tried to sell her that way, like Flaxie Martin and Backfire, she always turned out to be a wholesome and good-hearted woman. She seemed more at home opposite Danny Kaye in pictures like Wonder Man, The Kid from Brooklyn, and The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Although Raymond Burr and Henry Morgan pretty much steal this show from a colorful cast of bit players, let's acknowledge versatile Gene Lockhart for his role as the wonderfully named Warnie Hazard. You'd think that a guy with the name Warnie Hazard would know better than to go walking around a desolate trucking yard at night. You have to admire an actor who signs on for a role this thankless, coming off a Broadway run playing Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman. And Lockhart was the rare Hollywood actor of the time, making movies alongside his daughter, June Lockhart. She'd go on to be one of the most familiar faces on America's TV screens, starring in Lassie and Lost in Space. But she left a little mark in film noir as well, appearing in Bury Me Dead and T-Men, both in 1947. Next week on Noir Alley, I'll be joined once again by Chris Mitchum, son of Robert. We'll be presenting Where Danger Lives, one of those noirs that was a Robert Mitchum specialty, where not even the world's coolest cat can protect himself from a gorgeous and unhinged woman. Until then, let us know what you thought of Red Light on our Facebook and Twitter pages. And if you're watching this in a hotel room, you might want to check out that Gideon Bible in the nightstand. No telling what you might find in there.